Case number 1 is that of Richard Reid, better known to the world as the Shoe Bomber. His name became infamous in 2001 when he attempted to carry out one of the most audacious acts of terror in aviation history. On a transatlantic flight from Paris to Miami with nearly 200 innocent passengers aboard, Reid tried to detonate explosives hidden inside his shoes. His plan was simple but catastrophic: bring down an American Airlines flight mid-air in the name of extremist ideology. Reid was born in London in 1973, the son of a British father and a Jamaican mother. His early years were marked by instability, petty crime, and time spent in youth detention. During imprisonment, he converted to Islam, a turning point that initially offered structure but soon led him down a path of radicalization. Upon release, Reid fell under the influence of extremist preachers connected to al-Qaeda networks operating throughout Europe. He traveled across Pakistan and Afghanistan, where he reportedly received terrorist training and was assigned a mission to strike fear into the West through an airborne attack. On December 20, 2001, just months after the September 11th attacks, Richard Reid boarded American Airlines Flight 63 from Paris to Miami. Hidden in the soles of his black leather shoes was a powerful explosive compound, enough to tear apart the aircraft at cruising altitude. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Reid bent down in his seat, attempting to light a fuse that would detonate the bomb. But fate, and the courage of ordinary passengers, intervened. When smoke began rising from his seat, fellow travelers and flight attendants quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Passengers leapt into action, wrestling him to the ground as he struggled to ignite the explosive. In the chaos, several were injured, but their bravery saved 197 lives. The flight was diverted to Boston's Logan International Airport, where Reid was immediately taken into custody. The failed attack led to sweeping new security measures, most notably the requirement for all airline passengers to remove their shoes during screening, a direct legacy of his crime. In court, Richard Reid showed no remorse. He declared allegiance to al-Qaeda and referred to himself as a soldier of Islam. During sentencing, the judge called him a dangerous, committed, and unrepentant terrorist. Reid was handed 3 life sentences plus 110 years, ensuring he would never again see freedom. He is currently held at the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, one of the most secure facilities in the world, alongside some of the most notorious terrorists in modern history. For investigators, Reid's failed plot was more than just an isolated act of terror. It exposed the lingering reach of al-Qaeda's global network and the vulnerabilities of aviation security in the aftermath of 9/11. For the public, it was a chilling reminder that terrorism wasn't confined to large-scale attacks. Even one person with the right weapon and motive could end hundreds of lives in an instant. Richard Reid's story is a testament to how radical ideology can corrupt the lost and aimless. He wasn't a mastermind or a military strategist. He was a follower, a man manipulated into believing that murder equaled martyrdom. His attempt failed, but the fear it generated reshaped how the world travels to this day. And while his plot was stopped before tragedy struck, the next case reveals a plan that was far broader, more coordinated, and terrifyingly close to success. A conspiracy to attack the very heart of New York City in the name of ISIS. Case number 2 is that of Abdulrahman el-Banassawi, a young man whose plot to unleash terror on New York City could have resulted in one of the deadliest attacks since 9/11. In 2016, el-Banassawi conspired with other ISIS supporters to carry out coordinated bombings and mass shootings across Manhattan, targeting iconic locations like Times Square, subway stations, and concert venues filled with civilians. His plan, if successful, would have turned one of the world's most vibrant cities into a war zone. El-Banassawi's story began far from the Middle East. He was born and raised in Mississauga, Canada, a seemingly ordinary teenager from a middle-class family. But behind the suburban calm, he battled severe mental illness and a growing sense of alienation. At just 17, he became obsessed with extremist propaganda online. Through encrypted chat rooms, he connected with ISIS operatives who exploited his vulnerability, feeding him a narrative of glory, belonging, and revenge against the West. By early 2016, El-Banasawi was no longer just a sympathizer. He was an active recruit. Together with co-conspirators in the United States and Pakistan, he began mapping out an attack inspired by the 2015 Paris massacres. The plan was chilling in its ambition: plant bombs in subway cars, detonate explosives in Times Square, and follow the chaos with mass shootings. The objective was simple: to cause maximum death, panic, and destruction in the heart of America. In May of that year, El-Banasawi traveled from Canada to New Jersey, carrying bomb-making materials and blueprints. He believed the operation was ready to begin. What he didn't know was that the entire plot had already been infiltrated by undercover FBI agents posing as ISIS contacts. His messages, detailing every step of the plan, were being monitored in real time. He spoke of his desire to create the next 9/11 and bragged about how Americans would burn in their streets. When he arrived in the U.S., El-Banasawi was arrested before he could take a single life. Authorities seized electronic devices containing detailed instructions for constructing pressure cooker bombs and messages coordinating with his co-conspirators. The arrests of the other suspects followed swiftly, bringing an end to the plot before it could begin. In court, the magnitude of the plan stunned even hardened prosecutors. The evidence, hundreds of pages of chat logs, maps, and diagrams, revealed a teenager radicalized beyond recognition. El-Banasawi pleaded guilty to terrorism-related offenses, including conspiracy to use weapons of mass destruction and to commit acts of terrorism transcending national boundaries. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged his mental health issues, but stressed that the potential devastation of his actions could not be ignored. He was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, a punishment reflecting both the gravity of his intentions and the mercy shown to his youth and mental state. Today, he remains incarcerated in a high-security facility in the United States, his name listed among those who nearly changed the course of modern New York history. The case of Abdulrahman El-Banasawi is a haunting example of how extremism preys on the young and vulnerable, how ideology can transform confusion into conviction and loneliness into lethal purpose. His crime never came to fruition, but the threat he represented was real, and it served as a stark warning to governments worldwide about the power of online radicalization. While Richard Reed acted alone in the sky, El-Banasawi's plan was orchestrated from afar, a digital conspiracy crossing borders and time zones. And as we move from cyber coordination to physical brutality, the next case tells the story of a terrorist cell whose cruelty became infamous for its barbarism. Men who called themselves the Beatles and turned captivity into execution in the deserts of Syria. Case number 3 is that of Alexander Ayan Cote, a name tied to one of the most feared and sadistic terrorist groups in modern history. He was a key member of the ISIS execution cell infamously known as the Beatles, a nickname given by hostages because of their British accents. Alongside his accomplices, Cody kidnapped, tortured, and murdered multiple Western hostages, including journalists and humanitarian workers such as James Foley, Stephen Sotloff, Kayla Mueller, and Peter Kassig. Their horrific acts were filmed and broadcast by ISIS to spread fear across the world. Born in London in 1983 to a Ghanaian father and a Greek Cypriot mother, Cody grew up in a multicultural but fractured environment. He was raised in Shepherd's Bush, an area where he struggled with identity and belonging. As a teenager, he drifted toward crime, substance abuse, and extremism. By his early 30s, he had fully embraced jihadist ideology. Drawn by the rise of ISIS in the early 2010s, Cote traveled to Syria, where he met Mohammed Emwazi, better known as Jihadi John, and El Shafi El Sheikh. Together, they formed one of the most brutal ISIS units in existence. The cell's primary mission was to kidnap and terrorize Western captives. They operated in and around Raqqa, Syria, the de facto capital of the ISIS Caliphate. Hostages later described their treatment at the hands of the Beatles as pure psychological and physical torment. They were beaten, starved, and forced to witness the execution of fellow captives. Cote was known as the more calculating of the group. cold, articulate, and unwavering in his loyalty to ISIS. Between 2012 and 2015, the group executed several Western hostages, posting the gruesome videos online as propaganda. These executions shocked the world and galvanized the international coalition against ISIS. As the group's power crumbled under sustained military assault, members of the Beatles scattered, some killed in drone strikes, others captured while attempting to flee. In 2018, Alexander Kote and El Shafi El-Sheikh were captured by Kurdish forces in Syria while trying to escape into Turkey. The U.S. quickly took custody of the two men, and after lengthy diplomatic negotiations, they were extradited to the United States to face justice. Their capture marked the end of a long international manhunt that had spanned years and continents. In 2021, Cody pleaded guilty to 8 counts of terrorism, including conspiracy to kidnap, torture, and murder U.S. citizens. During sentencing, he expressed limited remorse, acknowledging the suffering he had caused but attempting to frame his actions as the product of war. His words fell flat in a courtroom filled with the families of those he helped kill. One father called him the embodiment of evil, a man who had stripped humanity from those he murdered. Cody was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole and transferred to the ADX Florence Supermax prison in Colorado, the same facility holding Richard Reed and other high-profile terrorists. His partner, El-Sheikh, received a similar sentence months later. The case of Alexander A.N. Kote stands as one of the most significant terrorism prosecutions of the decade, not only for the scale of his crimes, but for the justice it brought to the victims' families after years of anguish. The cell he belonged to symbolized ISIS's darkest brutality, using Western captives as tools of fear and propaganda. Cody's life serves as a grim reminder of how radicalization can transform the disillusioned into instruments of unimaginable cruelty. His name, like those of his victims, will be remembered, but for entirely different reasons. And as this story of international terror closes, the next case takes us from the deserts of Syria to the streets of Boston, where 2 brothers carried out one of the most devastating attacks on American soil, using nothing more than homemade bombs and hate. Case number 4 is that of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, one half of the brotherly duo behind the Boston Marathon bombing, one of the most shocking domestic terrorist attacks in modern American history. On April 15, 2013, what began as a day of athletic triumph and civic pride turned into chaos and carnage when 2 pressure cooker bombs exploded near the finish line, killing 3 people and injuring more than 260 others. The attack, carried out in the name of extremist ideology, tore through the heart of Boston and changed the city forever. Dzhokhar was born in Kyrgyzstan in 1993 and moved to the United States with his Chechen family when he was 8. They sought a new life, one free from conflict and persecution, settling first in Massachusetts. By all outward appearances, Dzhokhar was an ordinary young man, a college student, well-liked, and seemingly integrated into American life. But beneath that facade, he was drifting toward radicalization, influenced heavily by his older brother Tamerlan Tsarnaev, whose growing obsession with jihadist ideology would soon consume them both. In early 2013, the brothers began constructing homemade explosives based on instructions from Al-Qaeda's online magazine, Inspire. They packed pressure cookers with nails, ball bearings, and gunpowder, weapons designed to cause maximum pain and death. Their target was not a military base or government facility, but civilians, men, women, and children gathered to cheer on marathon runners at the finish line on Boylston Street. At 2:49 p.m., the first bomb exploded. Seconds later, the second detonated a short distance away. The blasts ripped through the crowd, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. Among the dead were Martin Richard, an 8-year-old boy, Crystal Campbell, 29, and Lingzi Liu, a graduate student from China. Hundreds more suffered life-changing injuries, many losing limbs in the chaos that followed. The city erupted into panic as emergency services rushed to aid the wounded. What followed was one of the largest manhunts in U.S. history. Surveillance footage quickly identified the brothers as suspects, leading to a violent pursuit through the streets of Watertown. The pair exchanged gunfire with police, throwing homemade explosives in a desperate bid to escape. Tamerlan was killed in the confrontation, while Dzhokhar managed to flee, hiding for nearly a day inside a boat in a suburban backyard. His capture ended a week of fear that had paralyzed the city. In court, Dzhokhar Tsarnaev faced 30 federal charges, including use of a weapon of mass destruction and conspiracy to bomb a public place. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance videos, eyewitnesses, and his own written confession scrawled on the inside of the boat where he was found. "The U.S. government kills our innocent civilians," he wrote, "so I can't stand to see such evil go unpunished." Those words sealed his fate. In 2015, a jury found him guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to death. Though his sentence has faced numerous appeals and reversals, as of 2022, the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty, affirming that the severity of his crimes warranted the ultimate punishment. Tsarnaev now sits on federal death row at the ADX Florence Supermax prison, where he remains under solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. For Boston, the attack was a scar that time has yet to fully heal. The resilience that followed, captured in the rallying cry "Boston Strong," became a symbol of unity against hate. But for the families who lost loved ones and the survivors left with lifelong injuries, justice could never fully erase the pain. Dzhokhar Tsarnaev's story is a chilling reminder that terrorism does not always come from abroad. Sometimes it is born in the very places it seeks to destroy. His descent from student to mass murderer illustrates how ideology, when mixed with manipulation and misplaced loyalty, can turn youth into instruments of horror. And as we move from the streets of Boston to the heartland of America, the next case reveals an act of terror not inspired by foreign extremism, but by homegrown hatred, a bombing that shook the foundations of the nation itself, the Oklahoma City tragedy. Case number 5 is that of Terry Nichols, the man who stood alongside Timothy McVeigh in orchestrating one of the most devastating acts of domestic terrorism in United States history, the Oklahoma City bombing. On April 19, 1995, a truck loaded with explosives tore through the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people, including 19 children, and injuring hundreds more. It remains one of the deadliest terrorist attacks ever committed on American soil by its own citizens. Terry Nichols was born in Lapeer, Michigan in 1955, a quiet, soft-spoken man who seemed unlikely to be associated with mass murder. A former U.S. Army soldier, he met Timothy McVeigh during basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia. The two bonded over shared anti-government sentiments, fueled by paranoia, resentment, and the growing influence of the militia movement sweeping through parts of America in the early 1990s. The deadly standoff at Waco, Texas in 1993, where federal agents clashed with the Branch Davidians, resulting in dozens of deaths, became a turning point. Both Nichols and McVeigh saw it as evidence of government tyranny. What began as shared anger soon evolved into a deadly obsession. The two men started stockpiling weapons and explosives, studying bomb-making manuals, and plotting revenge against what they believed was a corrupt federal government. Nichols, though less outspoken than McVeigh, was instrumental in procuring and mixing the chemicals that would become the core of their weapon, a truck bomb made of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil, capable of leveling an entire building. On that fateful morning in April 1995, McVeigh drove a Ryder rental truck packed with nearly 5,000 pounds of explosives and parked it directly in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion ripped through the 9-story structure, collapsing floors and trapping hundreds beneath the rubble. The blast shattered windows up to 16 blocks away. The destruction was instant, the shock unimaginable. In the aftermath, rescue crews worked around the clock, pulling survivors and victims from the debris. America watched in disbelief as images of the crumbled building and the tiny body of a child being carried from the wreckage flooded television screens. The horror of the event galvanized the nation and sparked the largest federal investigation since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. McVeigh was arrested just 90 minutes after the bombing, stopped by a state trooper for driving without a license plate. Evidence quickly led investigators to Nichols, who had returned to his home in Kansas. There, authorities discovered bomb-making materials, blueprints, and documents linking him directly to the planning and preparation of the attack. Nichols was charged with conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction and involuntary manslaughter of federal agents. At trial, prosecutors portrayed him as a willing partner, the man who gathered the supplies, mixed the explosives, and provided logistical support. The defense argued that Nichols was a reluctant accomplice manipulated by McVeigh's fanaticism, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 1997, Nichols was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. McVeigh, meanwhile, was executed by lethal injection in 2001. Nichols now spends his days confined within the ADX Florence Supermax prison, the same facility that houses terrorists like Richard Reed and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, a grim gathering place for some of the most dangerous men in U.S. history. The Oklahoma City bombing left scars that still run deep. It was not just an attack on a building, it was an attack on the very idea of government, order, and trust. For Nichols, what began as anti-establishment anger became complicity in an act of unprecedented evil. His case stands as a warning about how ideology, once radicalized, can turn ordinary citizens into architects of destruction. And as we leave the ruins of Oklahoma City, the next case moves from the heartland to the shadows of global paranoia. The story of a man accused of plotting to unleash radioactive terror on American streets. Case number 6 is that of Jose Padilla, a U.S. citizen whose name became synonymous with one of the most unsettling fears of the post-9/11 era, the possibility of a dirty bomb attack on American soil. Once an ordinary man from Chicago, Padilla would go on to be accused of plotting to detonate a radiological weapon and of conspiring to wage war against the United States. His arrest and prosecution blurred the line between national security and civil liberty, raising chilling questions about how far a country should go to protect itself from terror. Born in 1970 in Brooklyn, New York, to Puerto Rican parents, Padilla grew up amid poverty, gang violence, and instability. As a teenager, he joined a street gang and was repeatedly in trouble with the law. After moving to Florida, he spent time in prison for assault before converting to Islam in the early 1990s. For a while, it seemed like faith had given him purpose, but in the years that followed, his spiritual journey took a dark turn. He began frequenting radical mosques and traveling abroad, eventually making his way to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where he reportedly came into contact with members of Al-Qaeda. According to U.S. intelligence, Padilla was recruited by senior terrorist figures who viewed him as a useful operative, an American citizen who could move freely across borders without raising suspicion. Their alleged plan was terrifying: send him back to the United States to build and detonate a dirty bomb, a conventional explosive packed with radioactive material that could spread contamination and panic across a major city. In May 2002, Jose Padilla was arrested at Chicago's O'Hare International Airport after returning from Pakistan. Attorney General John Ashcroft soon made the announcement that would thrust Padilla into the global spotlight, that a dirty bomb plot had been foiled. Overnight, he was labeled one of the most dangerous men in America, but the story quickly grew complicated. Investigators never found any radioactive materials, bomb parts, or definitive proof that Padilla had taken concrete steps to carry out the plan. What they did uncover was evidence linking him to Al-Qaeda training camps and a network of jihadist operatives. The government declared him an enemy combatant, and rather than face a traditional trial, Padilla was held in a military brig for 3 years without formal charges, an unprecedented move for a U.S. citizen. During his detention, Padilla was reportedly subjected to extreme isolation and interrogation tactics that his defense later described as psychological torture. When his case finally went to court in 2007, the focus had shifted. Instead of the alleged dirty bomb plot, Prosecutors charged him with conspiracy to murder, kidnap, and maim people overseas, and with providing material support to terrorists. The prosecution argued that Padilla had traveled abroad not as a misguided traveler, but as a trained recruit of al-Qaeda ready to carry out deadly missions. After a lengthy trial filled with classified evidence and witness testimony, Padilla was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 17 years and 4 months in federal prison, though later appeals led to his sentence being increased to 21 years due to the seriousness of his involvement in terrorism training and conspiracies. Padilla's case became one of the most debated in the War on Terror, a story about fear, power, and the fragile balance between liberty and security. To his supporters, he was a victim of government overreach, punished more for what he might have done than for what he actually did. To his critics, he was proof that homegrown extremism could emerge from anywhere, even within the country's own borders. Today, José Padilla remains incarcerated in a federal supermax facility, serving his sentence in near total isolation. His name, once tied to a weapon that never detonated, still serves as a symbol of how deeply the post-9/11 world changed, a world where suspicion alone could redefine justice. And as this story of fear and paranoia closes, the next case leads us into an even stranger plot, one involving a self-proclaimed inventor, a homemade death ray, and a plan to unleash invisible radiation on innocent civilians. Case number 7 is that of Glendon Scott Crawford, a man whose descent into hatred and delusion led him to attempt one of the most bizarre and chilling terror plots in modern American history. In 2013, Crawford, a self-proclaimed patriot from upstate New York, set out to build a radiation-emitting death ray, a weapon designed to silently kill people using invisible beams of energy. His targets included Muslim communities, government offices, and political figures he believed were enemies of America. What he envisioned was a weapon of mass destruction that could murder without sound, smoke, or warning. Crawford was born in 1964 and worked as an industrial mechanic for General Electric in Schenectady, New York. On the surface, he appeared to be an ordinary family man, quiet, hardworking, and polite. But beneath that facade, he was consumed by paranoia, conspiracy theories, and far-right ideology. He spent hours online consuming extremist propaganda and was particularly obsessed with the idea that Muslims were infiltrating the U.S. government. Over time, his beliefs hardened into a violent obsession. It began as a fantasy of revenge, but quickly turned into a calculated plan. Crawford envisioned a portable X-ray device capable of emitting lethal doses of radiation. He believed that by mounting it onto a vehicle, he could drive through neighborhoods or past government buildings, exposing people to deadly rays that would kill them days or weeks later, leaving no immediate trace. He described his plan as a way to defend America from what he saw as internal enemies. In early 2013, Crawford began seeking funding and technical assistance to make his deadly idea a reality. He approached local Jewish organizations and members of the Ku Klux Klan, hoping to recruit partners who shared his hatred. What he didn't know was that one of the individuals he contacted alerted authorities. The FBI and Department of Homeland Security soon launched an undercover investigation. Agents posed as willing collaborators, recording every conversation and tracking his progress. Crawford's arrogance became his downfall. He boasted to the undercover agents about his design, calling it Hiroshima on a truck. He explained that his device could kill from a distance and fantasized about using it against mosques and political leaders. The FBI supplied him with inert parts for what he thought was the weapon, carefully monitoring his every move. When agents finally moved in, they found blueprints, wiring, and the prototype for the device, proof that he had gone far beyond mere talk. In 2015, Glendon Scott Crawford was convicted of attempting to use a weapon of mass destruction and disseminating radiation with intent to kill. During his trial, prosecutors portrayed him as a man driven by hatred and delusion, someone who saw mass murder as a patriotic duty. His defense argued that he had been entrapped, manipulated by undercover agents into believing his plan was feasible. But the jury was unconvinced. The court called his crime uniquely sinister, a plan to kill in silence, without confrontation or warning. Crawford was sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, one of the harshest penalties ever given for a domestic terrorism plot that never reached execution. He remains incarcerated at a high-security facility, his legacy a warning of how ideology can twist intellect into insanity. What makes Crawford's case especially disturbing is not just what he planned to do, but how close he came to doing it. He wasn't a scientist or a soldier, just a man with enough technical knowledge and hatred to nearly turn fantasy into genocide. His story underscores a truth about terrorism in America. It doesn't always come from distant lands or organized cells. Sometimes it grows quietly at home, in garages, basements, and online forums, nurtured by anger and fear until it explodes into something monstrous. And as we leave the shadows of Crawford's radiation plot, the next case drags us into a real-world nightmare that did happen, an attack that turned an ordinary subway commute into a scene of blood and chaos beneath the streets of New York City. Case number 8 is that of Frank Robert James, the man responsible for one of the most harrowing modern-day attacks on New York City's transit system. On the morning of April 12, 2022, James boarded a crowded subway train in Brooklyn during rush hour, carrying a handgun, smoke grenades, and a bag of ammunition. Within minutes, he transformed an ordinary commute into a nightmare of terror, injuring 10 passengers and traumatizing an entire city. James was 62 years old, not a young extremist, but a man whose years of disillusionment and anger had hardened into a worldview filled with paranoia and hate. He was born in New York City and raised partly in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Over time, he became a drifter, living out of rented vans, posting erratic videos online in which he ranted about race, violence, and government control. His YouTube channel became a digital diary of grievances, where he often hinted that violence was the only way to make his voice heard. On that April morning, James boarded the N train at the Kings Highway station in Brooklyn. The car was packed with commuters, students, office workers, parents, all unaware that among them stood a man ready to commit a calculated act of terror. As the train approached 36th Street Station, James pulled a gas mask over his face, ignited 2 smoke canisters, and opened fire. The dense smoke filled the car as screams erupted. Bullets ricocheted off metal surfaces. Passengers ducked for cover, many crawling over each other to escape. In total, 33 bullets were fired. Miraculously, none of the victims died, but several suffered severe gunshot wounds. The scene that followed was chaos, smoke pouring out of the subway doors, injured riders collapsing onto the platform, and the smell of gunpowder lingering in the tunnels. James slipped away in the confusion, leaving behind his gun, a bag of ammunition, and a credit card, evidence that would soon lead investigators straight to him. For nearly 30 hours, New York City was on edge. The manhunt stretched across boroughs, involving hundreds of officers, federal agents, and transit authorities. Photos of James circulated online and on every news network in the country. Then, in a twist that stunned the public, James himself called the police tip line, claiming he was at a McDonald's in Manhattan. Minutes later, officers arrested him without resistance. In federal court, prosecutors described the attack as an act of domestic terrorism, meticulously planned to cause mass casualties and fear. They revealed that James had rented the U-Haul van used to transport his weapons and smoke devices from Philadelphia to Brooklyn, tracking his movements through surveillance footage and receipts. His online videos, filled with violent fantasies and warnings of a coming racial war, painted the portrait of a man consumed by rage and delusion. In 2023, Frank Robert James pleaded guilty to 10 counts of terrorism and violence against mass transit passengers. During sentencing, he expressed regret for the injuries he caused but denied being motivated by any specific ideology. The court saw through the ambiguity. He was sentenced to 10 concurrent life sentences plus 10 additional years, ensuring he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. James is now housed in a high-security federal facility, his case standing as one of the most significant domestic terror prosecutions in recent years. The attack prompted renewed scrutiny over subway security, surveillance, and mental health intervention, highlighting how warning signs often go unnoticed until it's too late. Frank Robert James's rampage was not the act of a foreign terrorist or an organized extremist. It was the act of an American citizen who let his bitterness, isolation, and delusions metastasize into violence. His story closes this series, a chain of men whose hatred, ideology, or instability turned them into architects of terror. And as the last echoes of his gunfire fade through the tunnels of Brooklyn, one truth remains constant across all these cases. Evil doesn't need an army. Sometimes it only needs one person, convinced that destruction will make the world finally hear their voice.